Though I do think there is also something that is more subtle and more insidious that goes back a very long way in the New York Times, stretching to the early 20th century, when they were covering Hindu in a way that Hinduism and Hindu beliefs and practices in a way that is absolutely shocking. And it's shocking to read it today. And there has never been any kind of accounting. There's never been any kind of reckoning at the New York Times for the way they've covered Hinduism in the way that they've done with other religions or other races or ethnicities. So you have to think to yourself, there is something that's maybe in the groundwater culturally at the New York Times that is racist.
Hello, namaste, and welcome to Citti Media. My name is Citti, and I'll be your host for this current affairs show. We've all seen how biased the Western media can be, especially against Hindus, India, and Prime Minister Modi since he took power in 2015. Now, we have not forensically examined a lot of these biases, but there is a best-selling author based in Israel, an American author, an essayist, a novelist, and a media commentator, Ashley Rindsberg, who's taken this task upon himself to examine the bias, the racist narratives that the New York Times in specific has been purveying against India and Hindus for a very long time now. Joining me is Ashley himself. Ashley ji, thank you so much for joining us. And as we say here in India, namaste.
Thank you, Sharon, and namaste to you as well.
Now, first of all, let me begin by asking you this. What was the genesis of the thought behind the book? You wrote a recent book called The Grey Lady Winked.
Yeah, I mean, and in the broadest sense, it was to just ask the question. I think a lot of people, and as you've expressed, we are given this gospel that certain news sources are just unquestionable, that you just cannot even doubt it, because if you do, you are labeled this or that. And that never sits right when you have something that is treated as sacred, but it's not a sacred object. You know, this is something that these are human beings that are producing news. And in the New York Times case specifically, I came across in a work of history about World War II, which is called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by a journalist named William Shirer, who casually noted in a footnote of that book that on the eve of World War II, the New York Times had published a story claiming that Poland had invaded Germany, and that is what actually set off the hostilities. And I kind of stopped in my tracks and said, couldn't this possibly be? I mean, how we all know that the fundamental idea of World War II is that Germany was on this quest for world dominations, beginning with Europe and beginning with Poland specifically. And I went to look and investigate and try to understand if that was true, number one. And if it was true, what else was being misreported by the New York Times from that period and from other periods throughout history. And that just led me deeper and deeper into these topics, into looking at world-changing historical events that the Times is misreporting really actually altered the course of history on. And that's what ended up producing The Grey Lady Winked.
Right. That's a very interesting, thought. Now, you've used the phrase folk journalism before, and I was just interested to know more about what this means.
It means when people do, folk psychology. There's a popular term or a term within the psychology and neuroscience field of folk psychology, when we just kind of extrapolate thoughts and ideas about psychology that seem kind of right. We don't have evidence. No one's actually studied this, or the person who's talking about it certainly hasn't provided the studies or the evidence to support what they're saying. And it's the same thing in journalism. I took that term specifically in this chapter I did about the New York Times reporting on veterans from the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they were claiming that these veterans were homicidal, that they were coming back to the United States and just killing people left and right. And they did a very big series on this. And when you look at the statistics, not only do they not bear it out, but the statistics tell the opposite story, that veterans were actually committing violent crimes at a lower rate than the average population. And you think to yourself, what are the New York Times, what are they actually doing when they're running a series like that? They're just taking a bias or an assumption and making it into, just expressing it, just putting it out into the world as if it's true without really having the hard evidence to show that it is. And that's something that we're seeing in a lot of areas and a lot of different topics that are being covered by the New York Times and other parts of the media, where there's just not evidence, there's not statistical support to prove and to show that what they're claiming is really the truth.
Right. Now, before going into the broader themes of your book, I wanted to address some of the themes pertaining to India. Now, you've also addressed this in your book and in your interviews earlier. The one question that people in India want to ask the Western media, specifically the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Time magazine, is that why are Indians, Hindus, and Hinduism for that matter, projected in a negative way for a very long time, right? And could you also summarize this in the context of a 21st century narrative?
Yeah, I think it's a very strange thing when you're looking at it from my point of view. When you're thinking to yourself, I understand why the New York Times is covering American politics in a certain way. Makes sense. I even can understand why they're covering Israeli politics in a certain way as well. I mean, Israeli politics are very tied into American politics, and the New York Times has this history, a Jewish history. But then you look at India and you're thinking, why would they choose to cover it one way or the other? Why are they building narratives that are clearly anti-Hindu and absolutely anti-Modi? Why do they feel like they have skin in the game? And I think at least a part of that answer is it challenges their worldview. It challenges their worldview when they look at a country that is succeeding on a model that they don't necessarily agree with, which is a model that is not, at least recently in India's more recent history, is more capitalist, is also pluralistic, without losing national identity. And that's something that I think fries the New York Times brain, because they're thinking either you're going to have a pluralistic society or you're going to have a nationalist society. They certainly don't want to allow the model of a nation that's able to do both at the same time to exist, because it really subverts their worldview, which is this black and white either or notion that either you're nationalist and you're a Nazi, or you're a pluralist and you're a very good socialist. Right. And I think that has a lot to do with how they're covering India, though I do think there is also something that is more subtle and more insidious that goes back a very long way in the New York Times, stretching to the early 20th century, when they were covering Hindu in a way that Hinduism and Hindu beliefs and practices in a way that is absolutely shocking. And it's shocking to read it today. And there has never been any kind of accounting, there's never been any kind of reckoning at the New York Times for the way they've covered Hinduism in the way that they've done with other religions or other races or ethnicities. So you have to think to yourself, there is something that's maybe in the groundwater culturally at the New York Times that is racist, to put it plainly.
What's the Hindu panic story that was published, I think, in a post 9/11 environment? I was very interested to know more about this.
Yeah, so that's what I mean when I'm saying that this goes back very long ways. And that was in around 1911. There was a wealthy woman, American woman named Sarah Ball, who was a widow who had inherited a lot of money. And she became very closely involved with Swami Vivekananda, who was, I'm sure has a very high profile in India, but at the time was also really credited with introducing Hinduism and Hindu beliefs to Americans. And she donated all of her money, she left it in her will to him and the Hindu Vedanta Society rather than to her own daughter. And so the daughter was very motivated to start agitating against this agreement. But the New York Times really picked up the mantle as well. And they started to talk about the quote unquote harmful influences of Hinduism. They Hinduism as, again, this is a quote, a strange cult. And they really cast it in terms of, again, another quote, a psychic conspiracy to mislead this woman. So these are all these kinds of very damaging racist tropes that the Times introduced not only into their own newspaper, but of course into the American public consciousness, because they were a very influential newspaper at the time, as they are today. And we can say, okay, this was a long time ago, but then we have to ask the question, why have they never held themselves to account for what they did? Why had they never gone back and looked at this the way they've looked at other races and cultures that they've covered in inappropriate ways, and tried to at least apologize for it, or to find an explanation, and to show that they've actually changed their ways, which it really doesn't seem that they have done.
Now, so this is during the early 20th century and not
Right.
21st, like I said. So I stand corrected. And
Yes.
this is actually a wrong precedent being set, because Swami Vivekananda spoke in Chicago just a few years before that. And you could see the tremendous amount of positivity that he spread with his speech over there. Now, in coming to the present day scenario, when you look at the NYT's coverage of India, it's been extensively anti-Hindu, anti-India, and anti-Modi, and I think most of us can agree on that. Now, one more coverage that specifically receives a lot of traction for the New York Times is that of India's Kashmir policy. Now, all said and done, fair enough, maybe they do have some grounds to criticize India in their perspective, but they're very mum about what happens in Xinjiang.
Yes, they have been. And this is something that I've been thinking and looking at more closely, because it is such a glaring omission when you're thinking there is by all accounts, or at least by most accounts, a genocide underway in China. And there is an ethnic minority being persecuted by an authoritarian government for no ostensible reason, aside from the fact that it's not that they're at war with one another. This is just pure oppression. And when you look at the New York Times' recent coverage this past year, let's say, if you go to their website and type it in and look what comes back, you're going to find very, very soft reporting about H&M and the effect that the controversy has on H&M and Zara, because they sell in China and they're experiencing a crackdown on their sales. You're going to see stuff about Japanese diplomatic relations with China in relation to the Uyghurs, and you're not going to see the hard reporting on what's actually happening on the ground to the Uyghur people and what's being perpetrated by China. And that really raises a question of why. Why are they not covering this in the way that it deserves to be covered, which is the way that you would assume the first major genocide of the 21st century ought to be covered, on a weekly basis, namely. And they are doing the exact opposite.
Right. And you also said, and I quote, New York Times portrayal of India as a backward place is characterized by funeral pyres and rapes. And I'm assuming that you're referring to the recent COVID coverage, but the broader question that I want to ask you is, why is there this almost Oriental bias against India, is what you call it?
I think it's one of these things where the New York Times holds its own viewpoint in such a pedestal that anything that differs from that is seen as backward, is seen as illegitimate. And when they're looking at Modi, and goes back to what they see as Modi pushing in their words, an extreme nationalist agenda, that anything associated with that has to be therefore illegitimate and backward. Because to say otherwise, and to say that India is fighting COVID just as every other nation is, maybe in some ways better, maybe some ways worse, but we're all in the same situation, would be to sort of factor Modi out of the political equation. And it's something that they just can't let go of, just as it was much the same with Trump in the US, where when Trump was the president of the United States, their coverage about COVID was very, very harsh and really taking the United States government to task for the number of deaths when their favorite candidate, which is Biden, took the office of the presidency. Despite having a higher number of deaths in the United States during the same period, the coverage was softened. And I think that's really what it is. It's just a very naked political slant that the Times is able to get away with because it is the New York Times, because it has
Right.
that wonderful brand and so much credibility, even though that's actually getting less and less over time.
Right. Mr. Rindsberg, one of the commonalities that India and Israel as an issue we face is cross-border terrorism. And, it's been happening for a while. So we've spoken about this much before 9/11 could happen and America woke up to it. But Israel is always portrayed as an aggressor in the Middle East, or as we call it, West Asia in India. But why is this happening to Israel in its case?
I think it's really the same reason, or a very similar one, with regard to breaking the model, breaking the worldview that the New York Times and its cohort really have cleaved to, which is globalist, which is universalistic, which is one that is forcing people to choose between the model of pluralism and the model of nationalism, and not allowing the two to meet. And Israel really does break that model. I mean, you look at Israel, and there is a pluralistic society here, and it's also one that's rooted in the history of a single nation, the nation of the Jewish people. So I think that's one part of it, and I also do think that in specifics, the New York Times has a Jewish issue, and I also do think it has a very specific Israel issue that goes back to the beliefs of its owners, a family called the Sulzbergers, who control the newspaper to this day. And since they founded the newspaper, they had always been anti-Zionist. And I'm guessing they had been, as far back as the Indian national movement goes, they probably were anti-Indian nationalist as well. I don't know, but it's a very, very interesting question to pursue.
And you've made a claim that the New York Times actually supported the Holocaust and the Nazis. Could you substantiate on this for our viewers, please?
In the late 1930s, so that episode that I mentioned earlier, where the New York Times reported that Poland invaded Germany, that was part of a pattern at the New York Times that was very, very sympathetic to the Nazis. And when I dug deeper, what I discovered was that their Berlin bureau had been run by a Nazi collaborator, a man who worked with the Nazis, who was very favored by them, who produced reporting that was so sympathetic to the Nazis that they would just read his news reports on German radio broadcasts without correcting them, because they read like propaganda for the Germans. So this was something that was very much at work at the New York Times during that period. And at the same time, they worked very hard to cover up and to downplay the Holocaust as it was unfolding. They did 6 front page stories in 6 years about the Holocaust. And again, this was the story of not just a decade or even a century, that was the story of a generation. The mechanized murder, genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of other people as well, is a story you would expect to see on the front page, if not every day, then certainly every week. And they, again, did the exact opposite. And that's something that really sticks in your throat, and you really can't square that with this myth about the New York Times as this newspaper has the sterling reputation and unending credibility for its great journalism.
Right. And as far as coverage of Soviet Union is concerned, do you think they've been very fair?
I think during the early days of the Soviet Union, the New York Times famously covered up the Ukraine famine that murdered, Stalin murdered 5 million or up to 7 million Ukrainians, partly in an effort to consolidate his power. And the New York Times covered it up. And again, you always come back to this question of why would they do such a thing? Why would you give up on the scoop of a decade or generation, right, news that's actually occurring, news that's incredibly important? Doesn't make any sense. But when you look at in this case, the business interest of the New York Times, which were aligned with very high level business concerns in the United States, which wanted to open up the Russian market, which had been severed from the US when the Soviets staged their coup d'etat. And they could not bring those trade relations back into being until the US government recognized the Soviets as the legitimate government of Russia. And that could not happen if the same Soviet government had just murdered 5 million of its own people. So the New York Times did the dirty work. They covered up the Ukraine famine, the genocide, and at the same time, they were very, very sympathetic to the Soviet cause. They were publishing news reports that were written by Soviet propaganda agents, and they were publishing them as news. And this was something that I think, again, aligned with a worldview that was universalistic, that looked at this socialist cause as the great cause of humankind, and that opposed any kind of nationalism, no matter what form it took.
Right. Mr. Rindsberg, you've been very critical of the 1619 project. Could you tell us why?
Yeah, the 1619 project, I think, is actually one of the most pernicious and dangerous of all the episodes that I cover in The Gray Lady Winked. And the reason for that is because the 1619 project has effectively changed the way we see the truth. And what the 1619 project is an expressly open effort to reframe American history from one that's rooted in liberty to one that's rooted in American slavery. And I don't think anyone will deny that America's history of slavery is one that deserves attention still today. And it's still something we need to focus on and to try to understand and to make people aware of its significance. But that is not the same thing as saying that America is rooted in slavery and that the institutions that govern America today are ones that are parts still of a slaveocracy, as the New York Times has called it. So when you look at how they achieved this big claim, this reframing of American history, they did it by publishing statements that were simply false, that they knew to be false. Statements like the Revolutionary War that won America its independence from Britain was fought in order to preserve slavery. And that's a claim that their own fact checkers, including a professor of African American history at Northwestern University, told them they could not make because it was simply not true. And they made it anyways because it served the ends. The truth was used to serve the ideological ends of the times. And that's a very dangerous shift from where you look at the truth not as an ends in itself, but as a means to ideological political goals.
Right. Very interesting. But before we move ahead, I want to ask you this. Why focus exclusively on the New York Times, but as opposed to whether the Times Magazine or the Washington Post for that matter?
It's because the New York Times is so much more influential, so much more powerful. As just one small example, they have won more Pulitzer Prizes than any other newspaper in America. They have won so many Pulitzers that their second closest competitor is just about half that number. Right. So their level of influence is unparalleled, and they are also a symbol of the American media. They're the flagship of the American news media, and that gives them an ability to set the agenda, the news agenda, the policy agenda, the cultural agenda, in a way that nobody else has. And for that reason, it was very important for me to hone in on this one single institution to look at what its effect and impact has been over time, and to try to understand what this means for today and for the future of news media and journalism and fake news and all these topics that are incredibly important to all of us today.
Right. Thank you so much for that. But, if I may take you back 5 or 6 years, you
Sure.
saw a paradigm shift in politics, ideologically speaking. You had Prime Minister Theresa May in the UK, you had President Donald Trump, then you had Prime Minister Modi in India. So you slowly saw institutions also reforming in one way or the other. Similarly, media institutions also started to change the narrative. They started to bring out a different perspective. So I have 2 questions for you. A, do you really believe in the concept of post-truth and what the narratives follow based on that? And B, are international institutions and domestic media in the United States and in India in danger of being compromised?
I do think that there is this new trend towards chasing the ideology rather than gathering the facts. And I think that's in part a product of the new business model that the newspapers around the world, and particularly in the US, are facing, which is used to be one of advertising. Their model, the business model is based on advertising, which meant that every single reader mattered because every reader looked at the ad, and that's what gave the ads value to the advertisers, and that drove revenue. Today, we are looking at a new business model that is based on subscription. And that means that something like 2% of a total readership is actually paying for the product. What that in turn means is that the editorial line of these newspapers is geared towards, is catering towards the most extreme or radical part of the readership, the one that's incentivized to pay for it. And that is exactly, I think, what explains why we are seeing this kind of radicalization of news, where news becomes opinion pushing rather than fact gathering, because that's what sells. That's what motivates these people to maintain their subscriptions. And, you know, in terms of your second question, which remind me again, where was?
So basically, you know, the New York Times and the international media, which were largely left liberal for a very long time, now talk about a post-truth environment because they have a different perspective being challenged to them.
Yeah, and I do think that's kind of the shift that a lot of people are seeing, especially at the New York Times, which is that it went from being classically liberal, which was something that, you know, a lot of longtime New York Times readers and subscribers supported. They supported a view that was pushing toward the left, but it was still rooted in a shared notion of the truth and an enlightenment conception of what the truth is, which is an objective thing that we're all trying to do our best to get to. And they moved to this model that is exactly post-truth, that is quote unquote woke, as we call it in the United States. And that is one which uses the truth to achieve ideological aims, which is openly about seeing truth as what empowers the right people and what, in their view, emancipates other people from slavery, rather than seeing truth as something that exists in and of itself, which has been the traditional model of journalism for a very long time until recently.
Right. Now, in that sense, you know, I'm really glad you spoke about woke culture because I think that's starting to penetrate into the Indian youth as well. Because even today, we have outdated concepts of, you know, secularism, socialism, and different other false notions being spread in leftist, universities and college campuses. So in that sense, why do you think such an ideological inclination holds relevance even today?
In terms of the woke, why is woke relevant today? I think for that very reason, because it incentivizes people to pick a side. And that's its danger, and that's its power, to say this: we're living in an either or society. Either you support X or you are a racist. I mean, that empowers people in such an easy manner, because nobody wants to be a racist. So we'll all throw our cards behind the ideology that's being promoted in these terms, rather than saying, you know, listen, guys, I have this view and you have this view, and maybe we can just talk about it. That's not very incentivizing. It's not going to get people out on the streets rioting and pushing for the kind of political change that they want to see, even though it obviously is much healthier for any democracy for us to be sitting at a table together and listening to one another. But it's not going to get people angry. And I think that's a lot of what this is about, is that you can get people fired up when you say either X or you're racist. That's an equation that really works, unfortunately, because it's a very damaging, and it's one that we're seeing is having a very insidious effect around the world.
Right. You're right. I mean, in terms of speaking of those binaries which exist, like at least the generation that I belong to, in journalism schools, we are taught to be unbiased and quote unquote neutral. The concept of neutrality has become such a sanctified notion that we realize that, you know, there is nothing else but the version of the truth being spread by one section of the media. Do you think that's slowly breaking with time?
I think that is something that that is being challenged in different ways. I think, you know, the woke ideologies that we're seeing in newsrooms, of course, has challenged that, because they're throwing it out the window. They're saying there is no such thing as objectivity. There is no such thing as truth. There's my truth. And my truth is the one that is ascendant, is the one that matters. But I think that is very anti-pluralistic, because it doesn't allow for enough room for us to speak about other people's perspectives on a single truth, on a single version of the truth. But I actually do think the concept of bias in news is very interesting, because I think it's okay. I think it's okay for someone to bring their own experiences, their own ideas and assumptions about the world to their reporting. It's natural. Human beings do that in all aspects of life, and journalists are humans too.
Yes.
But the problem is when there's an agenda. The problem is that when the news is being used to serve interests, whether those are financial interests or ideological ones. And that's a big shift from kind of soft bias that we've seen in the past. And some places still just have that as well. You read an article and it's obviously not your perspective. It's not one that you would choose, but you can relate to it because you feel like this person is being intellectually honest. That is a very different thing from someone who's going out there to prove something at all cost, much as the 1619 Project has done, at any cost, including to the truth. And that's where we really see this split happening in the news media.
I'm 100% in agreement with you, because when my friends from the left speak about neutrality and being unbiased, I tell them that, maybe you can subscribe to it, but I recognize the fact that I'm somewhat biased, because it's a cognitive bias at the end of the day. It comes from what you read, what you see, what you watch, and the human experience itself. I'm really glad that we brought that out. And finally, before we conclude, Mr. Rindsberg, do you have a message to our viewers? And please, could you tell us more about your book?
My message to viewers is one that I've been really developing through this book and through speaking about it, which is that there is now another way, which is for us to search for our facts, to search for the stories, and to cut out all the fat that we receive in the news media and this kind of passive approach to news consumption. Go on a news diet, go on a media diet, get rid of the 90% of the news that's kind of just being force-fed to you through different channels, and choose 2 or 3 things that are really, really important to you, and go find the truth. Go find the good sources, go find the good reporters and the good news outlets, and stick to it and become an expert such that you yourself can be a part of the chain of journalism and that you can be a reliable source. I think that's a great model, and it's one that is being made available to us because of the internet, because of independent media, because of podcasts like this one and news networks like the one you're a part of. So I think that is a great way that people can sort of empower themselves. And with regard to The Gray Lady Winked, that's the message that I hope people can take away from it. Is the same one. It's that do what I did, which is go do the research on the topics that are important to you. And what you'll find is that it turns into something significant to you and to the people around you, and people really do appreciate it.
Right. Thank you so much for taking your time out to join us for a conversation. I'm very sure that a lot of youngsters, a lot of our audience is going to resonate with what you have to say. And please do order Mr. Rindsberg's book. And I'll be reading it as well. I'll be ordering it first thing as soon as we conclude this interview. Again,
thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's been a very, very interesting conversation for me.
It's a very interesting conversation. It's my pleasure to host you, and I hope you can join us again.
Thank you.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.